Good day, my beautiful children. Today is Thursday, May 8th, and we're continuing with our discussion of the war in Vietnam. Today we're talking about combat. And before we get started, I just want to say, we don't ever want to glorify war. Um, it's terrible, it's awful. Uh, and But there are some interesting things to learn about Vietnam because it's fairly unique in the way that it was fought. So today, I'm just going to give you some general descriptions about what the battle was like, and then I'm going to try and link some actual footage of some actual firefights during the Vietnam War. Uh, so let's jump into this. As you know, after the assassination of President Kennedy, President Johnson took over and immediately began to escalate the war in Vietnam with the reinstatement of the draft, and we began to increase the number of troops in Vietnam. And at this point, we were way past just being observers. We're there to train the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN. We were there to fight and engage the enemy. So LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, he hoped that air power would win the war. After World War II, it's pretty evident that um, aerial bombing was a great way to decimate your enemy and defeat them. And we had all kinds of planes and all kinds of bombs. And the idea was we were going to bomb the North Vietnamese back into the Stone Age. There's a problem with this. And the problem is that, number one, uh, much of Vietnam was controlled or was covered by jungle. So you couldn't really see what you were bombing. And number two, there were places that we couldn't go. We couldn't bomb into Cambodia and other places. And the North Vietnamese knew this. And so they would move a lot of their troops and a lot of their equipment and supplies along a road called the Ho Chi Minh Trail that ran in the jungles through Cambodia, where they knew that the United States Air Force wasn't allowed to bomb. But anyway, the idea to bomb them into submission was called Operation Rolling Thunder. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. But we dropped uh, thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of bombs during the Vietnam War, several times more than were dropped in World War II. We also, during this time, escalated the ground war. Between 1965 and 1967, we quadrupled our troop numbers, or almost quadrupled them, from 185,000 to 486,000 soldiers. And so you're fighting, the United States was fighting two human enemies. We had the regular army of North Vietnam. That would be the Viet Minh army, who were regular soldiers, and then they were fighting those peasant guerrilla fighters, the Viet Cong, who were stationed all over the South. And then there's a third enemy that isn't even human. It's the jungle. The jungle itself became an enemy because the Vietnamese knew it and knew every inch of it, and were able to use it to hide and to conduct guerrilla, surprise attacks, ambushes. And they had dug miles and miles and miles of underground tunnels, and they used it to their advantage. And so one of the things that the United States tried to do is to combat that was to just burn the jungle down or destroy it. So they used a couple different things. They used napalm. Napalm is a truly awful substance. It is essentially jellied gasoline. And when it is dropped, it burns and it sticks like glue, like jelly. And if you get it on you, it will stay on your body and continue to burn, and it's awful stuff. Well, that was used to burn the jungle. They also use cluster bombs, which is exactly what they sound like. These are bombs that have large bombs that inside of them have little tiny bomblets that then when they drop, it's almost like a shotgun. They spread these tiny bombs out and they all blow up. And then defoliants, so weed killer basically. And these were chemicals like Agent Orange that were meant to destroy the jungle, just like you would destroy weeds in your yard. The problem we found out after the fact is that a lot of these chemicals that were being used were major cancer-causing agents. That we had soldiers in Vietnam that survived the war, but then later died of cancer from being exposed to Agent Orange and other chemicals. My uncle Don served in Vietnam and currently has cancer because of Agent Orange. So these are really awful things. Long story short, none of that worked. The jungle, it's a living, breathing organism, and it grows rapidly. And as soon as they burned a section down, within a few months, it would grow back, and people were able to. The Vietnamese were able to use it to hide again. Most battles were not large scale in the open battles. They were tiny battles, usually involving one American platoon and then a hidden enemy, and they were called firefights. And these were intense, usually short, kind of pop up battles. So you'd have a platoon that would be out on patrol, and they would be ambushed by the Viet Cong or by the Viet Minh, and the combat would last for a matter of minutes, and then the Viet Cong would collect their dead and disappear back into the jungle and live to fight another day. And they also use, like, besides guerrilla warfare and hit and run tactics, they use booby traps. They had snipers. They had sappers, people that would dig tunnels and set explosives. And like I said, if you watch any movies about Vietnam or you see any documentaries, people will talk about how they were under constant fear of attack because you never knew where the next ambush was going to come from. Very rarely would they attack during the day or out in the open. It's usually at night, or it was from ambush, and it was very intense. It's war as hell anyway, no matter how you slice it. But this type of war was exceptionally intense and nerve wracking on people. So the rule of the day for the American troops was search and destroy. What they would do is they would have a base, and that would be heavily fortified, and then they would send out patrols that would go out from the base, looking for the enemy, trying to find Viet Cong encampments, or try and find a major installation of the Viet Minh. And then when they found them, they would engage in a firefight, and they would call in fire support, either from artillery or from air power. And at this point, we have jets that can now drop, napalm or other bombs, and we have helicopters that could come in with machine guns and rockets and try to attack the enemy as part of a support force. And that's kind of how combat went. Now there were a few major battles, especially later in the war, but for the most part, it was these quick firefights that kind of ruled the day. So I want to show you some pictures here and talk about some of these things a little bit. This is an example of Operation Rolling Thunder. And over here we see North Vietnamese anti-aircraft that was used to shoot down U.S. planes. We had a number of planes that were shot down and pilots that would be captured. If you guys know who John McCain was, he recently passed away, but he was a senator from Arizona. He was shot down and he was held for years in a North Vietnamese prison camp. And that had happened to several pilots. Here we see the kind of aircraft we're talking about with jets. These are jets that are refueling in air. These are ground-to-air missiles that were used to shoot down U.S. planes. Helicopters became the workhorse of the Vietnam War. So the helicopter was a new invention, and the deal with helicopters is they take off straight up, and they come straight down, and they could carry troops, and they could also hover in place, and they could provide air cover for troops, and they could be used also to not only take troops into battle and drop them off very quickly in the jungle, but also pick up wounded. And so here are just a few of the helicopters. This is a Bell Huey that is a gunship. You can see it has a chain gun on the side of it. This is a machine gun that could fire hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rounds per second or per minute, excuse me. This is another Huey that this one was used. You can see it has undermounted missiles and also machine guns, but they would use these to transport troops in and out of the combat zone. And then these are larger helicopters that were used for troop transport and also to take supplies into the bases and things like that. Okay, so what we see here are VC, Viet Cong, that are setting punji sticks in a rice paddy. And so what would happen is they'd put these punji sticks in the ground, and these were just sharpened stakes, and sometimes would be smeared with human excrement, with poop. And the idea was that U.S. soldiers would step on them, and it wouldn't kill them, but it would incapacitate them. It would keep them from being able to go out on patrol again. And if they stepped on one of the poisoned ones, it could cause some sort of infection. So you see in this picture, nobody's going to step in these because these are out of the open. But this is before the rainy season, and when it rained, it would cover this patio with water, and you wouldn't be able to see any of these sticks underneath the water. They also set tripwires and mines everywhere. Um, they dug tunnels uh, and did a lot of things. This is, by the way, a punji stick trap. You could see this would be they'd lay a mat over the top of this and cover it with leaves and things, and then somebody would step in it and fall. And this is what it looks like when you get pierced by one. Pretty gross and pretty awful, but that's the damage that it does. This weapon here is a Kalashnikov. It's an AK-47, which became the weapon of choice for the Vietnamese. First of all, there's most of them, many of them are Russian models or Chinese models. Again, this is the Cold War. America didn't fight the Russians um, directly, but the Russians were backing the North Vietnamese and the communist forces by giving them weapons and training them. The Chinese were doing the same thing. So even though we didn't fight the Russians were involved in this by backing the communist forces of North Vietnam. The AK-47 is an important gun. Still to this day, it's super cheap to produce. There are very few parts to it, so it's easy to clean and to disassemble and put back together again. And it rarely ever breaks down. And the United States, the main gun of the U.S. Army during that time was the M16, and the M16 would often jam and would get wet or dirty and would gum up. And the AK-47 proved to be a superior weapon because you could take this thing through anything and it would still fire. And so many U.S. troops were usually on the lookout for these to pick up from dead Vietnamese soldiers, and then they would try and use them themselves because they were a better weapon. So here we see tunnels, and like I said, there were hundreds and hundreds of miles of these tunnels dug, and so this gives you an idea. You'd go to a peasant village, and on the surface, it would look like a normal peasant village. There'd be grass huts and things like that, and everything would look fine. And what you didn't know is that hidden underneath the village, oftentimes, were miles of underground tunnels that would then be used by the Viet Cong to move troops and to move supplies and to hide weapons and ammunition and things like that. And so this led to some dicey situations. For example, you go in the American forces, we'd go on platoon and we go into a village, and they do a search and destroy, and they would end up wrecking the village looking for Viet Cong, um, tunnels and other hidden things, even if there were none there. And obviously, that caused a lot of bad blood between the peasants and the people of South Vietnam and the people in the United States Army. If they did find these things, they would burn the whole village to the ground, and this led to some pretty awful things. You guys have probably heard of the My Lai massacre. This is an event where American troops, basically wiped out an entire village of men, women, and children. And these things happen. They're usually not reported on from our side, at least, or usually from the winning side. But that was one that got reported on. So there were a couple of jobs if you were a soldier in Vietnam that you did not want. One of them was walking point. Walking point meant that you were up first in line on patrol, and that meant that you would be the first potentially to be shot by a sniper, or the first to trip a trip mine or a booby trap. And they had all kinds of mines. They had the kind where you just step on them and they explode. They had mines called bouncing betties that were really awful. You'd trip them and they would pop up to about waist height, and then they would explode. Those are really awful. Um, so walking point was one job you didn't want. Another job you didn't want would be that of a tunnel rat. And tunnel rats were soldiers who it was their job to go down into these tunnels when they found them and go search them and then destroy them. And so it had to be a smaller guy. And typically they only had enough room to go down with a flashlight and a handgun, and they would have to go down, and you never knew what you would encounter down there. You could find soldiers, Viet Cong soldiers. You could find booby traps and other things. And so this is a very intense, uh, very heroic job that these guys were asked to do, to go down into these tunnels during the Vietnam War. Those are two gigs you would not want. So this is what a firefight looks like, and you can see these aren't taking place in the open; these are taking place in the jungle, and it's very close ranged combat. When they would ambush the Viet Cong, or the Viet Minh would ambush, they would be right on top of the U.S. troops when this would happen. And so these firefights were very intense, very close quarter, and everybody at this point had handheld machine guns like the M16 here, or the AK-47. Although they did use other weapons, they used semi-automatic weapons and handguns and shotguns and things like that, rocket launchers and mortars and other things. What have I done? That is not what I wanted to do. Let's see if I can jump back. There we go. So this is really intense. And like I said, these images that we're seeing here, these would be beamed back into U.S. households on the evening news, and people would see all this death and destruction. And it was very demoralizing for many Americans to see this every day, and really help mold public opinion. And not everybody was against the war, but many were. This was not a very popular war for a lot of Americans. It wasn't like World War II, where everybody could pretty much wrap their head around, we're trying to fight the Nazis or fight Japanese imperialism, or it's revenge for Pearl Harbor. This one was a little different. We're thousands of miles away in a jungle, fighting people about communism, and like, a lot of Americans could not wrap their head around why we were there, why we were even there in the first place. And this also led to people treating our troops very poorly. Many troops reported when they came home that they were spit on by people at the airport and called baby killers and things, because again, people would see these images of these villages that had been burned and children that had been hurt. And if you're a soldier, like, you have a job to do. I don't know what you guys think about this, but um, it wasn't their fault that they were over in this mess. The government had sent them, and most of them were drafted and didn't have a choice. And then to have their own people turn on them would be just terrible. Now, again, not everybody treated soldiers terribly, and not everybody hated the war, but many did. That's a big part of the story. All right, we're gonna not talk about Vietnam era protests, because you'll get into that in U.S. history. But we're gonna stop for today. I am going to link some authentic Vietnam War era combat footage. It's going to be intense, so be prepared for that. And I am also going to have a worksheet for you guys on Monday with a few questions about the Vietnam uh, lesson. And I will link this PowerPoint so you guys can go back and check through and look at things to help you. But that's it for today. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will speak to you guys again on Monday. Peace and love.